Lauren Adams, legal director for the Women's Liberation Front. This is a very liberal feminist, overtly and openly liberal, but who has found much common ground with conservatives in America the last several months. She is fighting and suing to keep biological males out of the prison cells of females. In California particularly, there's quite a racket. All you have to do is say as you identify as a woman, and you can get into the female prison. There have been some horrific sexual assaults and physical assaults and psychological torment going on in the California female prison system because of this policy. Lauren Adams sued that. She has a lot to say about Leah Thomas, a biological male identifying as a female, competing in the NCAA female swimming championship and winning, and a little bit to say about, believe it or not, Judge Jackson's inability during last week's Supreme Court nomination hearing to be able to define what a woman is. I think she took great umbrage to that, Lauren Adams did. We're going to ask her about that as well. Great show today. We're going to take a quick commercial break, get queued up. When we come back, Lauren Adams, first up, legal director for the Women's Liberation Front, followed by my good friend, the great investigator, the great whistleblower champion, Jason Foster. What a show. Hope you enjoy it. If you're looking to add a little money to your budget, it's a very good time to consider a mortgage refinance because, believe it or not, it's a rather easy way to save up to $1,000 a month. That's right. You heard me right. $1,000 a month. Who wouldn't want that in their back pocket in this time of high inflation? Now, here's how it works. You call American Financing for a free mortgage review. No pressure, no obligation, no upfront or hidden fees. Just a simple conversation with a salary-based mortgage consultant where you learn about the custom loans that may be a better fit because there's more to a refinance than just a lower rate. You can access cash, consolidate debt, or upgrade your home. You could even skip 2 payments, creating greater upfront savings. Now think of all the possibilities, then make that call to American Financing. If you start soon, you may close in as fast as 10 days. That's unbelievable. So call 866-890-7706. Let me give you that again. That's 866-890-7706 or visit AmericanFinancing.net. NMLS 182334. Let me give you that again. NMLSConsumerAccess.org.
On the Jordan Harbinger Show, you'll hear amazing stories from people that have lived them, from spies to CEOs, even an undercover agent who infiltrated the Gambino crime family. You're about to hear a preview of the Jordan Harbinger Show with Jack Garcia, who did just that.
My career was 24 out of 26 years was solely dedicated working undercover. Now I walk in, I'm in the bar. Now there's a barmaid there, good-looking young lady. She's serving me a drink. Yeah, what would you like? My drink was give me a Kettle One martini, 3 olives, glass of water on the side. I finish the drink. The guys come in. I'm going to go in my pocket, take out the big wad of money. Bam, I give her $100. If you're with the mob, I say, hey, Jordan, you're on record with us. That means we protect you. Nobody could shake you down. We could shake you down, but you're on record with us.
For more on how Jack became so trusted in the highest levels of the Gambino organization, check out episode 392 of The Jordan Harbinger Show.
All right, folks, welcome back from the commercial break. So glad you rejoined us. We have a great guest. She's been on this podcast before, doing some really important work in the space of prisons. And of course, among many examples of the continuing censorship that's going on in America. It's a head scratcher. Joining me right now is Lauren Adams, legal director for the Women's Liberation Front. Lauren, great to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start just to remind people, because it's been a while since you're on the show, what the Women's Liberation Front does and its stances and what it's particularly tried to do in the state of California against the prison system.
Yeah, so we are the largest national feminist organization who is working on women's rights. Most of the real big hitters, women's rights organizations, don't actually fight for women's rights anymore. There's other groups that have had to step up and take over on that. In California, we've sued the state of California over their policy of putting male offenders into women's prisons. They passed a bill that took effect early last year, that allowed people to, in the prison setting, to choose what sex they are treated as for the purposes of housing and for other purposes. And there have been about 300 requests from the men's prison to transfer to the women's prison, and they've already transferred several dozen, which has had a number of awful effects. And it's inhumane and it's a violation of their rights. So we are seeking to rectify that.
Yeah. And when you say negative effects, right, there have been sexual assaults in the prison by some of these biological males on biological females, correct?
Yeah, sexual assaults, physical assaults, sexual harassment, intimidation, threats, exhibitionism, voyeurism. I mean, there's no privacy in there. So it's really easy to kind of get peeped on, and it's almost impossible to prove that someone's doing it intentionally, but you have them. Almost all of these men are, almost none of them have had surgery of any kind or anything. Right. So these are just regular intact men.
Yep. They just say they identify as a woman, but they're clear biological males.
The law only requires that they say that they identify.
Right.
They don't have to identify as women, actually. Right. They just have to identify as not men. So they can identify as, I think the statute says they can be non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, and they give a bunch of other examples.
Categories,
so
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, all you literally you don't have to say you identify as a woman. You don't have to take hormones. The prisons are not allowed to take anatomy into account when making housing decisions. So essentially, and since there's no women transferring to the men's prison, we essentially now have men's prisons and co-ed prisons, basically.
Wow. Unreal. That's a remarkable moment. And I want to clarify, you're not discriminating. You don't have any problem with a person's choice to identify. What you're worried about is the safety and security issues and psychological things that this is causing for the women in the prison, correct?
Absolutely. And there's two really, I guess, important things to remember. And one is that our arguments are really based on sex. So we are seeking to have male people removed from the women's prison. There are a lot of biological females in the women's prison who identify as men or identify as non-binary, and we want them to stay put where it's safe, So it's not that we don't like certain people or, want them to generally be away from women. It's that we just think that prisons, like domestic violence shelters, like sports, like everything else, should be separated by sex when it makes sense to, which is usually. So I think that's important to remember. The other thing that that's really important to know, and as far as I know, this is not applicable to the general population, but specifically in the prison context, males who identify as transgender are dramatically more likely to be sex offenders, according to state and federal data.
Wow.
So in the federal system, 48% of men who self-identify as transgender are sex offenders. That's data from the Bureau of Prisons. And in California, it's 38%. And a third of those who have requested transfers are sex offenders. And that's compared to only like 14% of the regular male population and a negligible portion of the female population.
Yeah, so it's statistically significant. This is a significant data point.
Oh, yeah. And we've gotten public records requests on the crimes committed by the men. So these are men who are already in the women's facilities. And it's horrific. There's forcible rape. There's vicious sex crimes and arson, kidnapping, murder, things like that. There's one there for raping and torturing 2 women. Oh. There's one who's there for killing 2 infants, and the mother of those infants is in there with him. It's as awful as you can imagine it being. Yeah. Or worse.
Just extraordinary. Wow. I mean, this is such an important issue. Now, let me see if I got this right. I almost have a hard time saying that this was said, but were you actually accused of committing genocide by word simply by trying to defend the women in these prisons?
Oh, yeah. And that lovely creature who wrote that in that editorial by name, saying it said a lot of stuff, but genocide by word caught my particular attention too.
Yes, it would catch mine too.
Yeah, so the man who wrote that, his name is Michael Contreras Hernandez. He is serving a life sentence for multiple murders. He killed a man in the men's prison before transferring to the women's prison. And his behavior is so erratic that the women who have shared cells with him have taken turns staying awake at night because he stays awake, or at times has, I think it's drug induced is the speculation from the women who are spending time around him, that he's a very dangerous person. And, you know, he's an intact male. He's very scary and intimidating.
And a history of violence, a history of bad conduct.
Yes, that's the guy who's accusing me of genocide by word. Is the literal murderer.
Unreal.
And weirdo.
Unreal. You recently were kicked off a fundraising platform where you were trying to raise money to help these women in the prison. Talk a little bit about what happens there and what was your sin? What was your violation?
They didn't say. They just said we violated. So yeah, it was. So we used Give Butter because, you know, we felt that it was less likely to deplatform us than GoFundMe. We've seen how people have been treated on there, and we wanted to use a platform that in the past has been less, you know, inclined to censor. So yes, all they said, they did not give us a reason. We've appealed, and they just said it was the most innocuous thing too. We were just a national fundraiser. It was trying to get the state by state thing. You could give to the money that your region, so you could give to the Midwest if you're in the Midwest, and it was very much not the fundraiser you'd expect to get canceled, I guess.
Yeah,
and
no.
We're a 501c3 public charity. I mean,
it is unreal.
Not that anyone should be censored, but
yeah, but I mean, you're already approved. And when people understand this part of the work, I mean, this is just about a safety issue. This is about making sure that women in prisons don't get victimized in some form. And it's just. To me, it's mind-boggling to see how far we've come. Let me walk you through some of the recent headlines and get your take on where you stand. You're obviously you're very liberal, right? You're politically liberal, and so yeah. And when you see, let's take on Leah Thomas. She's competing as a biological male against women in the NCAA championship, taking most of the awards. You see that some of the pictures where you see the other swimmers who would have been first if it weren't for Leah Thomas being in the lineup. This disappointment, the frustration. How do you reconcile it? What goes to your mind when you see that?
That it's a natural and predictable consequence of these policies that we can expect to see more of as time goes on. And I think that obviously it's unconscionable and to take away those opportunities for women to compete. And if you look at people will say, oh, it's a small number of people, but look how many women were displaced by his participation, how many were knocked off the team or the chance to compete, the chance to go to the next level and things like that. It's completely absurd. And he's in the locker room naked. Apparently they have trouble getting him to cover up. It's completely predictable and foreseeable.
Yeah. So, you're a feminist, but you don't support biological males competing against females, right?
No, not when it's not for female-only teams. Absolutely not. I mean, obviously there's co-ed teams that exist.
Right, of course. Yeah, I just didn't say that well, but on an all-female sport, right? Yeah,
in situations, whether it's sports or otherwise, where it is permissible and ethical to exclude males, right? Locker rooms, et cetera, sports.
Right.
I don't believe that there should be exceptions for certain kinds of males.
Yep, it's a pretty straightforward answer. And let me take you to an answer that wasn't so straightforward just a few days ago. Obviously, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson going through her confirmation. And I understand the politics of this. Republicans are trying to create moments. But they asked her, could she define a woman? And the first 2 or 3 times she couldn't. As a feminist, what did that feel like, seeing another woman who couldn't define what a woman was?
It's very disappointing. It's very disappointing to hear that. And also, again, predictable, because that any candidate or any nominee who's put forth by this president is going to have already been vetted for their opinion on this subject.
Right.
It's absurd. Some of the stuff you can only laugh at too. I've seen memes go around where you have a cop pulled someone over and said, "Do you know how fast you were going?" And he says, "Sir, I'm not a physicist." But yeah, it's really,
that's kind of funny, actually.
Yeah. There's a lot of good ones. But yes, it's very disappointing. And I really, really do hope that it was just one of those moments, like you said, and not something that is indicative of how she would rule on the bench. Because I do think she's, my organization doesn't have a position on her. I do personally think she would be overall a good justice. And I think that this is really unfortunate, and I hope it's not representative of how she actually feels, even though it's what she needs to say, right?
It seems as though this cancel culture has made even very smart, bright people hesitant to answer questions that used to be common sense. You could answer them without consequence, and now people are afraid to be caught in the cancel culture and censorship world. And there's no doubt that Judge Jackson is a very bright person, well-educated, well-spoken, couldn't find the courage to answer that question, which, by the way, is not very hard to answer. I think it's more not only a statement about her, it's probably more a statement about this moment in our country where we can't even have common sense conversation. Rachel Levine, the high-ranking HHS official who is also an admiral, recently was named by USA to be as one of its Women of the Year. Your thought about a biological male, obviously transgender identifying, getting a Woman of the Year award?
I think it's a travesty. You're really doing the greatest hits of all my favorite people right now.
Sorry about that. Well, these are the moments. I mean, this is what people really are talking about. Obviously not on Twitter because you get thrown off on there, but in homes, we're all struggling with this.
Of course. And Rachel Levine is truly an absurd individual who's not fit for the office. If for no other reason than his views on child transitioning that Senator Paul asked about during the confirmation hearings last year, as like the secretary, or what was it, the Secretary of Health? I can't remember. Was it Pennsylvania? I'm trying to think of
it was Pennsylvania, right? Yeah, that's right.
Made terrible decisions and said terrible things about children's ability to consent to life-altering procedures, sterilizing procedures without their parents' consent, or, kids in the foster system talking about how they should be fast-tracked. So I think that this person, I think it's terrible. Just, again, someone who's knocked off the list, right? There's a woman who's not being honored because of that. And they have to. You know that if they didn't include someone like that, how complaints there would be that the list wasn't, inclusive enough.
Yeah. It's really remarkable. Are we in this cycle forever, or is there a moment where people realize, hey, let's stop the world for a second. I want to get off and have a common sense conversation. Do we get to a point in the future where we can have an honest conversation that, we don't all agree with what the elitists say. We don't agree with these policies. We want our daughters to compete against daughters in sports. Again, never discriminating. This doesn't have to go the other way and say, we're going to discriminate, make fun of people. That's going backwards, but certainly there's a legitimate debate in America, and there's a small group of people that are trying to prevent that debate from occurring. Can it be overcome?
I think so, and I think it will be, although I don't know the timeline, but I think it's really helpful to think of what we're going through right now as a moral panic. And I'm not trying to say this as to be over dramatic, but I think of the Salem witch trials and what people got caught up in, or the Red Scare, or just things like that, where there's just this escalating, having to have the right opinions and the consequences of it. They just want to destroy people. It's unsustainable just in human group psychology, I really think. So I just am looking for the end of it. I say that people talking and people getting together and sharing ideas is really valuable. Like you said, just regular people.
Yeah.
I love the work that I do with our nonpartisan partners. We work all across the spectrum, left to right, at WoLF, and I just learned so much, and it's made me a much better person, I think, just being exposed to more ideas and more kinds of people getting along. And I think we're going to just see more of that. People are going to start to opt out of some of the online stuff.
I think you're right. In fact, I have a theory. A lot of times conservatives say, "Oh, I'm being shadow banned on Twitter." I'm not sure we're being shadow banned. I think that many people have just dropped off the platform and didn't cancel their accounts. I think there's a moment where people are just saying, "Oh my God, stop this! I'm not going to go on that for this." And it's funny how sometimes free market forces end up sorting these things out. Which is, all right, you guys want to have that. You can be that, but I'm not joining your product anymore. I think it's not going to be a boycott. It's just going to be people like, I'm moving on to something else. That doesn't match my values. You have so much that your group does. And, obviously the prison lawsuit is very important. You strongly support women in so many different ways. There's a lot of conservative listeners on this podcast. They may not agree with all of the philosophies, but the idea that women should be protected, that young girls should be protected is something we all universally share. What are some of the other things that you're doing at WLF?
Yeah, so we have, our core issue areas include reproductive autonomy, which is broader than, for us, just abortion rights, which I know is definitely something the audience probably. But we look at it as the right to have children too. Right. So the right against sterilization, and that goes into some of the child transitioning things and the things that we do to harm young people, and sterilization. You look at what's going on in China, surrogacy, commercial surrogacy, and other commercial sexual and reproductive exploitation, pornography, and prostitution. All of these things go hand in hand. The people who are promoting things like putting men in women's prisons are also promoting legalizing other ways that women are objectified and exploited for profit. I mean, porn is like a many billion-dollar a year industry, and it is harming. People make fun of, some states have declared it a public health crisis, and people make fun of that. I almost think that's understating it. Yeah. What it does to the people who view it or participate in it is just very harmful. So we work against that a lot. And then for LGBT rights, so for the rights of lesbian and bisexual women, which again is much more expansive than things like marriage or adoption rights. It really goes into political autonomy and the right to self-definition. And we have found a lot of common ground with our conservative partners on those issues of, people need to be able to decide who they're associating with and what they can say about themselves and about groups that they're a part of. And right now you have lesbians who get kicked off Twitter for saying that, lesbians don't have male parts.
Yeah. It's unreal.
It's really,
and
they're not getting their bans overturned. It's
amazing.
So that's kind of what we do at WoLF.
I know you also, and I want to ask about this, but sex trafficking seems to be on the rise in a very significant way. Many of the law enforcement officers I'm talking to are raising really serious concerns about it. How bad is the problem? And America is clearly ground zero for it. We're one of the largest repositories of sex trafficking rings. How bad a situation do we have in this country right now? And what can we do to not only support the victims that have been rescued, but also to try to stop the scourge?
It is really bad. And I think some of it just being, we have such a decentralized legal system. We got 50 states and then there's federal, and it can be really hard to stop what is a very ever-moving process of moving people around. I do think the best way to probably on a larger level support this is to fight against the legalization of prostitution. There's a lot of really well-intentioned people who say, okay, the best way to really get help to victims is to make sure that it's not, criminalized, right. And then people can, but we see in other places that have legalized it where all it does is end up increasing demand. And when you increase demand, then you need people to increase supply. So they bring in, that's where you get more trafficking to that area from other areas. And it just, as soon as you have the government saying this is okay to do, it's legal to do, then it kind of gives some moral permission to some people too. So I think really resisting that urge to try and do that. We support the equality model, which is also called the Nordic Model, which decriminalizes the selling of sex, but not the buying of sex. So it means that women and children who are prostituted, who are, exploited, are not charged with crimes. They're treated as victims, but that those who buy sex and those who traffic and pimps and all of that, that they're still charged.
Yeah, so important. It is. You're doing a lot of important work, and it's shameful to think that the very important work you're doing is being thwarted in some way by this insane censorship moment that is going on. If people want to get involved or do something, how can they get involved with WoLF?
Well, you can follow us on social media. You can go to our website at womensliberationfront.org and sign up for our email list. We often have calls to action that are state-specific and opportunities to testify, and we have resources for people who might want to get involved in their own state and just find out what's going on and learn the latest things. But we're not going to let ourselves be deplatformed. We'll just keep finding new platforms. We're not going to be quiet.
That's it. Yeah, don't stop. Eventually, you're going to beat them. There's no doubt about it. That's what we've learned in the censorship game. Somewhere soon, there's a platform that's actually going to respect free speech, and there are many now. They're coming up all over the place. So, Lauren, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I know you're fighting some very important parts. A lot of people don't want to think about these issues. They don't want to know that there are men sleeping in biological men sleeping in women's prison cells and assaulting women. And you make us and force us to think about it so that we can solve the problem. And we're really grateful for that work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. This is great.
A lot of fun.